the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. This is episode 393. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site, with Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, the SB Nation Arizona Cardinals site, and one of the hosts of the original Draft Breakdown podcast, Seth Cox, with us for another one of our new format. That's what we think moving forward. We're going to do more shorter shows, so maybe it's not the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, but the best hours of Cardinals talk on the web. Maybe we'll have to change that tagline a little bit. But yeah, we're here to talk about the playoffs and the Super Bowl, and a little bit about the coaching situation because we've got the Super Bowl matchup set. It is the Philadelphia Eagles against the Kansas City Chiefs in two different games that went very differently. And then we're going to talk about the situation with the Cardinals. We've got a little bit more news when it comes to Sean Payton, Vic Fangio, and another coaching candidate, Seth. So first off, how are we feeling about these more often shorter shows so far?
It should be fun, man. Get these takes off a little more frequently and with a little less time in between, right?
Yeah, especially in the offseason, we'll see how things will go. I anticipate something that I haven't really done is just bringing on other guests to talk about whatever. Maybe I can grab a draft prospect or two through their ages leading up to the draft. Cardinals players. I don't know about that. Depends on the Cardinals whether they go for that. But in this episode, let's talk about. We just finished watching the two playoff games. The 49ers and Eagles played. The Bengals and Chiefs played. And we got some coaching outcomes for that. Let's kind of break things down, not take too long. But let's first talk about the afternoon game. San Francisco 49ers against the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles come away with a big win. And I will say this. It was mildly, I didn't know what to expect, but oh my gosh, injuries. The Eagles come away with a 31-7 win over the 49ers, in which there was Christian McCaffrey dynamic, but the 49ers couldn't overcome the quarterback injuries on to Brock Purdy, their third-string rookie quarterback. He got hurt early. The 49ers decided to not block Hassan Reddick with the tackle. He goes out with the injury, and John Johnson comes into the game, and then he gets hit. He gets a concussion. He's out. Brock Purdy has to come in, and this is the fun stat line. Okay, Brock Purdy started and finished the game, did not have an incomplete pass, and the 49ers lost. No, that is an actual true thing, but he only threw 4 passes, and so, yeah, it was kind of it. Now, this was a defensive ball game. The Eagles won the game with 269 total yards of offense, and the San Francisco 49ers managed to muster only 164 yards of offense because, obviously we know why, because they were down to their fourth-string quarterback that they'd signed a month ago, basically. What were your biggest takeaways from that game, Seth?
That it's really hard to win with your third quarterback, let alone fourth quarterback, let alone running backs only. That's at the end of the day, the fatal flaw of the 49ers was that they are a great running team. Sets everything up off their ability to run. However, it's really, really difficult to do anything else when all you can do is run, when you can't throw. And so all of a sudden, all those things don't work out. Their early work on Hassan Reddick, which ended up being, I believe he was the one that hit Purdy on the injury.
He was the one that got him on the arm when on that play. He finished
And-
he had 2 first-half sacks, and that was basically all the Eagles needed because after that it was just grinding out the win.
Well, and they only had 3 for the game, but they somehow had 7 quarterback hits. And you might be like, oh, that's not much. 7 quarterback hits in 18 passing attempts. So it was
There were 25 dropbacks essentially.
Right. No, that's what I'm saying. There were 7 additional quarterback hits, where they got to the quarterback.
That's true. That's true. So they had 18 attempted passes.
Yeah.
7. Well, no. Okay. So it was 20. It ended up being 21.
Yeah.
21 dropbacks, and they were hit 7 times.
Yeah. And so a third of the time they drop back, they're getting hit. And so it's crazy. And you look, Christian McCaffrey had 5.6 yards a carry. So it's not like they slowed down the running game. They did in the sense that they were able to shut down any semblance of Deebo Samuel getting the ball, but that's because they could sell out. They could just sell out because they knew nobody was going to throw the ball. And so, that was the big takeaway. It was also interesting because you look at it, and this is one of the things that we're going to try to do with these shows before we get into, doing 2 Cardinals-based shows a week, is that how does this tie back into the Cardinals? Well, let's take a look. Jalen Hurts on the day was 15 for 25 for 121 yards. That's less than 5 yards per attempt average, which for those of you
It's
at
bad.
home,
It's bad.
that's really bad. That's worse than Josh Johnson or Brock Purdy were. And so
yeah, and it's on top of that is that they only sacked Hurts once for no loss of yards. So Eric Armstead got credit for 1 sack. It was at the line of scrimmage. So it wasn't like the offensive line played terribly. Hurts had time and missed a lot of throws.
And that's just what it was. And so when you look at it, Hurts has been phenomenal this season and in the running for the MVP, deservedly so. But in a league driven by star quarterbacks, there are a lot of teams that are able to get away with their quarterback playing a C or D level game and still winning. And now again, it's rare to come up against a team that's playing their 4th quarterback. It's just rare. But in this sense, that's how it happened this year. It worked out for the Eagles. We'll see what happens in the Super Bowl. But, you look at the Kyler Murray situation, and you can't tell me that you wouldn't be able to get 150 total yards of offense from Kyler Murray in a game and win by 4 touchdowns, because that's kind of what we have said is an issue. Kyler Murray is not Patrick Mahomes, and we'll get to Mahomes shortly, but he's not Patrick Mahomes. And I think that's a very fair assessment of his skill and a realistic.
While we've wanted him to be like Patrick Mahomes, I think we need to realize just how special that quarterback is. He has changed the game at the quarterback position because of his mobility and the dynamic passing. Just he has reset the standard for quarterback play.
Yeah, and we're talking potentially watching the greatest talent-wise quarterback we will ever see. And so to expect Kyler to carry a team at that level is not just unfair, but unrealistic. You look at, like Joe Burrow, and again, we'll get to him, did not play well today either. And he has maybe the best receiving core in the NFL. So those things happen. And so if you want to build your franchise around a quarterback, you have to do so in a way that it allows them to have off days. And that's what we saw in this first game, is that, unfortunately for the 49ers, and again, like, you'll never see, unlikely to see this again, but the fact that they just ended up not having anybody that could throw the ball in the second half, like that made it almost impossible.
Right.
Like
right.
they were going to be hurting the rest of the game.
Once the Eagles took a 14-point lead and then didn't have the passing game even available. But what I like, from the Cardinals' perspective, we look at two teams that constructed their rosters very differently. Well, and not the two of them didn't, but they did it very differently than the Cardinals, because both those teams put together and stacked talent on both sides of the ball with the intent of taking advantage of their young quarterback and building the best building the best team around that quarterback, so that the quarterback didn't have to do anything. Because remember, before everything happened with the 49ers this season, it was the Trey Lance show, and that lasted a game in a quarter, basically. But this team was built for Trey Lance. Jimmy Garoppolo came back, and we talked about bleeding into this season. Trey Lance, like Kyle Shanahan with Jimmy Garoppolo, win, because you have a guy that has he's a good to very good quarterback with the talent around him on that roster. That makes a team that's Super Bowl contending, even though he's probably the weak spot. With a guy like Trey Lance, and then he goes to Brock Purdy, you have an elite defense. You've got, and you look at the way that offense was put together, because you have the best left tackle in the game. You've got the best tight end in the game. You've got, in Christian McCaffrey, when healthy, the most talented running back in the game. And you've got Deebo Samuel, one of the most talented playmakers in the league, and then Brandon Ayuk on top of that. The quarterback position was always the weak spot, and so you just needed someone who wasn't going to mess things up. And Brock Purdy did pretty well with that. It's the only quarterback that Kyle Shanahan has any semblance of success with, other than Jimmy Garoppolo. And it'll be interesting how they move that moving forward. But that 49ers roster was built for a young quarterback to not have to carry them. The Eagles are the same way. They designed that offense. They put together playmakers on defense. Just look at that defensive front that they had. You had the Jordan Davis. You've got Javon Hargraves. You've got Fletcher Cox. You had Hassan Reddick. And then they traded for A.J. Brown. You've got Dallas Goedert. And then they build that offense around Jalen Hurts' skill set.
And they did get. I mean, that's the other thing too, is we talk about it a lot, and you talk about the draft and hitting guys, but realistically too, sometimes you just got to get lucky too, right? Like,
but then the Cardinals, what'd they do this last offseason?
Well, and no, they
signed a cornerback that hadn't played in a year, and then he tragically died. But that was like their big move, was to sign a cornerback who hadn't played in a year.
Right. And so you look at it though, like you're saying, like, the Eagles added a cornerback in James Bradbury, who, took advantage of a team that couldn't afford him. Right. So they traded for him, or they didn't have to. Can you remember?
I don't remember. Then they traded. I don't know why the Saints traded Carter Johnson.
Yeah, for virtually nothing. And then once you get to that point, then you have guys that want to come play for you, right? So then you end up with, a guy like Linval Joseph and a guy like
Ndamukong
Suh that come and play for you, and all of a sudden now you've got, and again, no offense, you've got two guys that would start for the Arizona Cardinals as rotational pieces.
Yes.
And then you look at the offensive side of the ball, and that's kind of, you were mentioning it. You've got a guy in Lane Johnson who's been there forever. That is what it is. You got a guy in Jordan Mailata who was a 7th round pick and just hit. Like, that's.
And then their center, Jason Kelce, amazing.
Right. A guy that was drafted in the 6th round. I mean, you look at their starters. We talk about it all the time. They drafted all of their starters, which is insane in and of itself. But Mailata is a freak of nature. Like, you're not that's just luck. That's great scouting. Don't get me wrong, but part of it's luck. Like it is what it is. Getting a guy like Lane Johnson, 4th overall, great pick. He's been great, and he's been around for now a decade, right? And like you talked about, Jason Kelsey, phenomenal pick, been around for what is it now, 14 seasons. Like that's part of luck, right? It's great scouting, but to get a center for 14 seasons, like that's absurd. Landon Dickerson was a 2nd-round pick. That's a great pick. And then Isaac Siamolo was a 3rd-round pick. So like all their entire offensive line draft picks. By the way, they have a 1st-round pick sitting on their bench in Andre Dillard that hasn't played. They've got a 2nd-round rookie that they picked in, that they moved up to pick in front of the Cardinals, and Cam Jurgens that doesn't play because they're preparing. And so that's the hope we have as Cardinals fans, right? That we'll see the same thing from the Monty Ossenfort, David Sears, led teams. But you go back and you look at it, again, their defensive line. You mentioned it, Brandon Graham. He's been around since 2010. Josh Sweat. I don't want to say lucky on that pick, but they were able to take advantage of a guy that was coming off a major knee injury and fell to the 4th round, and they hit. By the way, that 2018 draft for the Eagles they got Josh Sweat in the 4th round and Mayata in the 7th round. And those are 2 guys that are phenomenal starters. Yeah, they're not all pros, but they're great starters on a good team. Jordan Davis, you mentioned, Javon Hargrave is the only guy they really brought in outside of Hassan, and the rest of these guys are homegrown because that's what they do. You look at it, they brought in a Milton Williams, who Justin and I raved about on our podcast, from Louisiana Tech, in the 3rd round in 2021. And he's just, a rotational guy. They've got guys that they're able to bring in, and that's what it's about. And then you look at what they've done, and like you said, then they go, oh, okay, we need a wide receiver. We got Devontae Smith, fantastic. We swung and missed on Jalen Rager. We swung and missed on other guys. That's okay. You know what we'll do? We'll go get AJ Brown, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. And so you're able to do those things because you've got guys, and people want to talk about the quarterback contract, and that's true. Jalen Hurts is going to get a massive deal, probably surpassing Kyler's in the next year. But you look at it, you're able to do that when you have a left tackle that was a 7th-round pick. When your offensive line are able to be paid lesser and they work together as a unit. I mean, you look at Jason Kelsey, I don't think he's even in the top 5 in terms of center pay in the NFL, and he's literally the best center in the NFL. Same thing with their right tackle, Lane Johnson. I think he's, top 10 in pay, but like he's the best right tackle in the NFL. And so like you've got 2 at their position on the offensive line that are underpaid. You're able to underpay Hassan Reddick because you got him coming off a sin where he was only getting paid $6 million, and now all of a sudden wants to cash in.
Well, anything they paid him less than what he was looking for,
right? Because he got to go home. I mean, that was the old thing, that people don't understand, is that the Cardinals, even unless they extended him in 2020, like mid-season, they were never going to get ready because, as Justin Pugh said, that the bridge had been earned. But the other thing was, if you are coming up to it, this is a guy that got to play for the team that 25 minutes from his home. So that's what he went and did, come back to Arizona, who quite frankly, he was looked at as a bust in Arizona because of the usage that you saw from his coaches. And then, and then you move from there. So, instead now you're an AP, second team all pro and a Pro Bowler. So, you go do what's best for you, go make money. That's something that Jess and I always talk about, right? It's the best thing for them. And so that's how you build a team around a quarterback. But And so some of it is planning, like I said, drafting second and third round linemen every couple of years. But some of it's just luck too, like I said. Like,
And the Cardinals definitely not have good luck.
no,
Absolutely
not
not.
no, because honestly, what would happen with the Cardinals is that they would have drafted Andre Dillard, who was a well thought of prospect that the Eagles drafted 22nd overall in 2019, and he would have gotten hurt like he did his rookie year, and then not really ever made it, and then they would have gone and signed a overpriced veteran because that's how they operate, right?
Yep.
That, instead of saying, oh, you know what, we drafted Joshua Miles, let's see what he develops into, they would have been like, no, we got to go get throw a name out there, a Kelvin Beachum, who I like. I mean, Beacham's been good for him, but they would have gone and paid Kelvin Beachum, and then Miles ends up, sitting and never developing. Well, the Eagles didn't do that. They had the Andre Dillard situation, and they said, okay, we're going to put Mayata out there, and it's worked out.
Yeah.
And and that's how it worked. And it took, I think he was on the team for 3 years before he even really started getting starts. Yeah, he wasn't even, he didn't start until 2020. So he was in his third season. I mean, that's what good franchises do.
Yeah. Coming up next on the Rise Up Zero podcast, the best hour Cardinals talk on the web. Let's talk about the AFC Championship game, how that played out, what Cardinals takes can we take from there. That's coming up next on Rise Up Zero Red. We're back on the Rise Up Red podcast, the best hour Cardinals talk on the web. The Kansas City Chiefs finally got the Joe Burrow monkey off of their back and defeat the Bengals 23-20 with Patrick Mahomes gutting it out. Obviously not 100%, playing on that high ankle sprain. They go back to the Super Bowl for the third time in 4 years.
Yep.
They were in the AFC title game for 5 straight years. Patrick Mahomes has set a new standard for quarterback play. He's changed the game. So let's say that right now. But the kind of the thing that I want to talk about before we actually get to the game is let's look at the Mahomes situation, and it reminds me of the Budda Baker ankle sprain, how he gutted things out and played the very next week. He didn't miss any time because of that, and then he fractures his shoulder in the finale. He doesn't miss a snap, and there is this ongoing narrative about Kyler Murray, is that if he were in the same situation, that he would not have played. And so I want to kind of ask you this, Seth, if you think that's the case. If Kyler had a similar injury in the game last week, would he have played like Mahomes did, or would we have seen the Cardinals go with Colt McCoy if they were in the in the AFC title game, if they were in the playoffs period? Because what we've seen is kind of a mixed bag. Do you think that Kyler would have been a situation where no, he's going to rest to make sure it's 100%, or that he would have been a gamer?
That's an interesting question, because when you look at 2020, you go back to that 8-7 going into that game against the LA Rams, and they need to win the game, and Murray has an ankle issue.
High ankle sprain. That was a high ankle sprain in that game.
And he tried and couldn't do anything.
He did come back at the very end of the game, and people were wondering why it took so long.
Right. And so that's the thing, is like, I think he would have tested it, seen if he would have been able to help the team, and then gone from there. But, sometimes it is what it is, and you can't give it a go. And it's just a matter of ability to, put yourself in a position and your team in a position to be successful. So that's how I think he would have gone out there and probably started the game. And then if it didn't work out, you kind of would have seen McCoy the rest of the game. And that's kind of how it goes for guys. They have to be able to test it themselves and decide. I mean, we've heard from a couple people that he probably wasn't 100% when he came back this year.
No, I want to kind of go through some of the things that we know about that he's played through. 2019, his rookie year, 2019, tweaked his hamstring. He came back in that finale and played the finale with the bad hamstring and toughed it out. 2020, he came back to play. That was a high ankle sprain, so this is not just a run-of-the-mill rolled ankle. He suffered a high ankle sprain that he had to rehab in the offseason, but he came back in the same day to do that. He also played through a shoulder injury that year, if we recall, that he initially dinged up against Seattle, and then it got worse when he went for it when he dove forward against the Dolphins and took a big hit. And so he's played through injuries. He played through the wrist thing this year. He came back from the high ankle sprain in 2021 when it wasn't 100%. And we know Kyler hates missing, and I think it's partially being protective, but I think more than anything, him not playing through some of the injuries that he's had to play through, especially this year when he's dealing with a hamstring. It was a luxury they could do because of who they had as their backup quarterback. And I think the organization was saying, okay, we got Colt. We trust him. And so, Kyler, you're not playing. Kyler, you're not playing. And so it wasn't as much about Kyler saying, I don't want to play because I'm injured. It was a combination of him knowing that with Colt, they have a chance. Because if you remember in his rookie year, when it was Brett Hundley, Yeah. So,
and that's just it. And then that year
when they when they came back in, because it was Chris Streveler and they couldn't do it, and so he tried to come back in. So when they had a player, when they had a quarterback that they could trust, they're able to rest him. Now, granted, we'll talk about probably on the Tuesday show the report about his knee injury and how long it's going to take to come back. But I don't doubt for a minute, Kyler loves to play. He's competitive. If there's a way for him to physically be on the field, he would have done it. He would have done it. And I hate the narrative that he's soft. I think part of it maybe he's a little bit sports car, like those luxury sports cars where if they're high performance vehicles, but they need to be in tip top shape to do things. But I don't know if that's necessarily the case with him. Part of it's youth, but I'd like to think that he would have done the same thing Mahomes did and tried to gut it out, and then we'd go from there because of the nature of the game. That happens to Mahomes in the regular season, especially like midseason. He's not playing that game. They're rolling with Chad Henne. Come on. It's because it was the playoffs. Kyler would have played.
Yeah, and so and that's the thing is, like we said, he would have tried, and if it didn't work, it is what it is. And it's just one of those situations where, again, I think we also have to be realistic about the level of ability. Like, a lot of people ask me all the time, where would you rank Kyler among quarterbacks? I'm like, he's probably a top 12 guy. Like, there's probably guys, and I think outside of maybe the top one or two guys, the next grouping kind of fluctuates year to year.
5 to 12 is, you could put them in almost any order probably.
And it kind of, and it fluctuates based on, who's healthy, who's not, this and that. But that's the thing is, like, you look at Mahomes' performance today, and it wasn't at the end just the ankle. He was also down his top 3 receivers, and he still put up 326 yards and 2 touchdowns. And then the big run at the end of the game to get them in a position to win. And it's one of those situations where that's where I try to tell people, well, they need to find a Patrick Mahomes. So does every other team in the league. Like, there's one guy. People mistake, winning for ability. And what I mean by that is, people say, and we've talked about in the show, and I think you and I both agree with it, Tom Brady's, the GOAT because of how much he's won and what he's been able to do. But the reality is, from a talent perspective, Brady probably isn't
Now,
better.
what he did at the end of the last few years of his career, I think has elevated him. But the guy that you have to emulate at the quarterback position, you have to look at Peyton Manning. You have
Right.
to look at Peyton Manning as the best guy to play the position and perform. Brady did it differently, but
Right.
geez.
And so that's the thing, is like, people look at it and they get confused with greatest winner ever with um with the best to do it. And the reality is like, Mahomes, and by the way, I mean, like you said, 5 straight AFC championship games, so it's really hard to say like he's not going to do it every year. But like, Mahomes isn't going to win every year. But the reality is, he's so good that you have a chance every year. And that's what people don't get, is that, like, when you have a guy like Mahomes, it makes up for obvious flaws on your team. Like having Marquez Valdez Scantling, who is a very nice number 3, number 4 receiver in that offense, be your number 1 receiver in that game. And
Right.
I mean,
And this is a year after they traded away the most dynamic receiver in football, and Tyreek Hill.
right, and they basically had zero fall off. Like, they still had the best offense in the NFL. Patrick Mahomes was in a position to potentially break the all-time passing yardage record in the NFL. So again, when you look at it from this perspective, you have to understand and just get that you're not finding the next Patrick Mahomes. It's just not happening. Those guys, like you said, like Peyton Manning in his prime, those guys that put their team in a position to always compete. They may not always win, but always compete for championships and Super Bowls and things like that. They just don't come around very often. And so, like, it's the question becomes, what's around them? How do you fill in the gaps? And for the Chiefs, that was, hey, we can't pay Tyreek Hill. He's the best wide receiver in the NFL, but we can't pay him. So what we need to do is we need to, make sure that we add talent along our O-line. We need to add depth at our receiving position. We need to add talent on our defensive side of the ball, because we're, when we get to January and it's cold, and you can't expect Pat to throw for 300 plus yards. Well, he does it still because he's Patrick Mahomes, but it's just, he's a different cat. And so, like, you have to look at how the Bengals built. You have to look at how the Eagles built. You have to look at, like we've talked about, the 49ers or things. And I think the negative look that you can take about the Cardinals and where they're at, and put it on a team that was in the playoffs, is similar to the Bills, right? Like, oh, we got you this wide receiver. Oh, we keep adding running backs or drafting wide receivers or tight ends or doing these things, but like, and you're not, taking the next step, Josh Allen. And by taking the next step, obviously, I mean, getting us to the Super Bowl.
Right.
And it's like, well, where's your investment on the offensive line? Where's your investment at different positions? Like, you keep throwing skill guys, and then you get there and your offensive line's overwhelmed. Your defense, once Von Miller went down, who is 30 some odd years old, you had zero pass rush. Like, where are those investments as opposed to continuing to feed other positions? And I think that's kind of where the Cardinals were. It was like, Kyler, carry us to this point, and we got you, DeAndre Hopkins, we got you Marquise Brown, we got you, this stuff. And it's like, that's not what's needed. What's needed is to build a more complete team that can compete on both sides of the ball. That way, if Kyler goes 15 for 25 for 121 yards, you can still win by 4 touchdowns. Like, that's what you need. And you look at it, you look at the Bengals. Burrow didn't play well today. he 26 for 41, 270 yards. That's nice. 2 interceptions. And a couple of the touchdown was a great play by T. Higgins. And then Jamar Chase had that big 4th down conversion where, Burrow threw it into double coverage and let his guy make a play. Those things happen. And so this is the second aspect, and what we talked about with the Eagles. Sometimes you need luck. The one thing the Bengals focused on this offseason was what? Fixing that offensive line.
Yep.
They invested heavily. Well, 3 of those guys couldn't play today because, and so that's the thing is like, it's not to say don't do it. It's not going to work out. Well, luck is part of the game, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is.
And so when you look at who was the better, more complete team, probably the Bengals if they're healthy. But when you have the X factor, when you have the guy that changes everything and Patrick Mahomes, then you have to have guys like Jonah Williams. You have to have guys like Alex Kappa. You have to have guys like Lyle Collins. Like they have to be there, because if they're not, on 3rd and 6, you slide a beast like Chris Jones, who's one of the best defensive linemen in the NFL, right? And you put him against Hakeem Adeniji, and then you get a sack, and then you punt, and all of a sudden the events unfold like they did for the Chiefs to win. And that's all because Lyle Collins is out. That's not because they didn't invest or that they didn't try to take care of Joe Burrow. It's just unfortunately luck wasn't on their side. They lost 3 offensive linemen going into the AFC Championship game. It's really hard to beat that, and their defense did a great job. Gave them an opportunity a lot of times, and it just didn't work out.
Then the one thing that we want to play here is the what if game, because back in 2016, the Cardinals drafted a kid named Robert Condici with the 29th pick in the first round of the draft, a defensive lineman that had some off the field issues, and passed on a guy that all the teams passed on in Chris Jones. And he gets drafted by the Chiefs. He had off-field concerns as well. Robert Condici has done nothing in the NFL. Chris Jones, outside of Aaron Donald, probably the most dynamic and disruptive interior defensive lineman pass rusher that there is in the game. And, 65 career sacks since he entered the league, and he was a game record today. Kind of makes you wonder, and you posted that on Twitter, is actually during the game, what could have been. Goodness, the Cardinals could have drafted Chris Jones, but instead drafted Robert Condici, right?
Yeah, and I mean, we talk about the what if with Mahomes all the time, and you had a great anecdote that you can share shortly.
We'll save that one. We'll save that one as we're leading up to the Super Bowl.
But you have a great anecdote about that. But like, think about it. They drafted Condici, then the next season they drafted Hassan Reddick. They whiffed on Condici. They misplayed Hassan Reddick like any NFL team would have done for 2 seasons. They gave him a chance a couple times during his rookie season, but you and I have talked about this. The yo-yoing thing is probably the worst thing that they could have done for him, right? Because he never got snaps really at inside backer, or I shouldn't say that. He never got snaps at outside backer, was then thrust into that position when Marcus Golden goes down in game 1, I believe it was that year.
I think it was like game 4, but nonetheless.
Yeah, and so then they thrust him into that position, and all of a sudden he's like, I don't know what I'm doing. I haven't played this. I've been trying to learn how to play off-ball linebacker, so I have no idea what's going on. And he, let's be honest, he failed, right? Like, he didn't play well. And then they moved him back to off-ball
in the Steve Wilkes defense, but
right. And we're like, oh, that'll be really good for him. They'll use him like Shaq Thompson, who was a really good linebacker for a long time for Carolina, and he just couldn't play that. It didn't suit him. And so then, he wasn't getting reps as a 4-3 defensive end. So then you get the Vance Joseph defense, and was like, hey, let's try it again at off ball. And so
Nope.
by that point, the bridge, like Justin P tweeted, the bridge had been burned. But like, imagine if you had drafted Chris Jones and played Hassan Reddick correctly, that's what we talk about with luck a lot, right? You've got a dominant interior pass rusher and a great pass rusher. You let Chandler Jones walk like you did, and you move on to Hassan as your 17-18 million dollar a year pass rusher, and you still have Chris Jones, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, this defense is phenomenal. And makes all of a sudden then all those inside linebacker picks the last couple of years, they're probably playing a lot better because they're getting free runs at people because they can't stop those two guys. But yeah, I mean, it's just one of those situations, man. It's just, you swung and missed on a guy in Kim Diche, and a guy in Jones has become, like you said, a complete game-wrecking all-pro player. And like you said, everybody missed on it. It's just, we're Cardinals fans, and I talked a lot about Jones leading up to that draft on this podcast, and you and I did it about, he would be a great fit, and it's, unfortunate, and it didn't work out. And now, you're kind of seeing how it goes. But, that's one of the things the Cardinals need is a game-wrecking interior guy who's now been a 3-time second team All-Pro, 1-time, first team All-Pro, and a 4-time Pro Bowler. Like, that's a dominant guy. He's got 2 seasons with 15.5 sacks, which is crazy to think about.
Yep. Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's wrap up this edition of the show with some talk about the coaching situation. Sean Payton, a new candidate, Vic Fangio, and more. That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of our Cardinals talk on the web. We know that the Cardinals reportedly are resetting. They had their interview with Sean Payton on Thursday, and yeah, it was a day-long thing. It was one of those things where you almost expected to see a deal come out of it, but a deal didn't come out of it. And it feels like the report came out is that they're kind of mulling what they're going to do next. Do they make the move to get Payton, or do they move on with the other candidates? And that's kind of where we're at. Sean Payton was on, as he's an analyst on Fox Sports and NFL, in the studio, was asked about the situation, and it looks like this coming week will be kind of the telling tale. This week is the critical week. The door isn't closed. Things are still happening behind the scenes, and that makes sense. However, there's an interesting, as we talked about on this show, the defensive coordinator that's been thrown out there is the guy that Payton was going to bring in to whatever team he gets hired is Vic Fangio, who reportedly, as of Sunday morning, had agreed to a 3-year deal with the Miami Dolphins, making him the highest paid coordinator in the NFL, which kind of, for me, like as we talked about the show the last couple of weeks, the idea of Sean Payton and Vic Fangio is the easiest thing to just picture and working. Take Fangio out of the picture, it does muddy the water, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's interesting because you look at it, and like you said, they're reporting it from I think it was Tom Pelissero, right? But he hasn't signed yet. So I think that's the first thing that people need to understand is I don't think technically he can sign for another 2 weeks because he's on the Eagles staff. Right?
I could, yeah. Well, that's the thing. So anyone on the 49ers staff, but you can talk to him this week. You just can't hire a guy until after their season's over. So this week you can interview candidates this week because it's the bye week, and then it goes on. Then it shuts down for Super Bowl week, and then the Super Bowl coaches then are free to be hired after the season is over.
No, I know. Yeah, but I think he's working with the Eagles right now as a defensive consultant. That's what they list his job as.
Oh, that makes sense.
So I wonder. So I don't know. I don't know if that's what the rules are as a consultant. So I mean, obviously, if he's if he's signed. I don't know if he's technically even allowed to yet. I don't know what the rules are for a consultant. I don't know how that works. So, but yeah. So I mean, that's a huge thing. I think the other thing is, and I've texted some people about this and to try to get a gauge on what is going on with the Peyton situation, and it just seems like the reality is that Mickey Loomis and the Saints are kind of sticking to their guns. They're saying, give us multiple
2 first-round picks.
Right, give us multiple first. And I wonder, and obviously I'm not saying that this is what I would do, but I wonder if they would take the 3rd overall pick instead of 2, like later first round picks. But that again, I wouldn't do that. I'm not saying they should do that. I'm just wondering aloud. But it's interesting because it just feels like this is one of those situations where, and I text somebody this, they allegedly want to talk with the Eagles defensive coordinator, Jonathan Gannon. And so it would make sense that as of Thursday, they have their, 9, 10, 12-hour soiree with Sean Payton. And then from there, they kind of go back and forth negotiating, like, okay, what about this? What about this? And then this week, now they can interview, whether it's D'Amico Ryans, whether it's, Jonathan Gannon, whether it's an unnamed Chiefs guy, somebody else that they can interview these guys, right? It would make sense because now all of a sudden it's like, oh, we were waiting on Gannon to be available to interview him, give him this courtesy interview. All the while you're saying like, hey, we want to hire Sean Payton. What are you, will you take X? And they're like, no. And you're like, okay, what about Y? And they're like, no. And you're like, okay, what about Z? And they're like, no. And so you're like, so you're negotiating that portion of it, and you're able to do that behind the scenes while saying, okay, we're going to interview Jonathan Gannon. And then Gannon interviews, and then all of a sudden you go, okay, Brian Flores is our next head coach. Like, you get what I'm saying? Like, it kind of all just makes a little bit of sense in that they've been able to play that well because it just came to that timing of like, hey, let's interview Peyton, and then we can't talk to any of these NFC Championship guys, and then we'll talk to one of them after, or any of these championship game guys, I should say, I guess. And then we'll talk to one of them afterwards, all while we try to get something done with Peyton. And then if it doesn't come to fruition, we're able to move on and we can go to Brian Flores or, a new candidate. Who knows?
This whole coaching situation is kind of muddled. And the one thing that seems to be clear is that Vance Joseph seems to be off the list. Now, granted, it's not like they would need a second interview with him. He was not mentioned the candidates that they were going to move forward with in a recent report. So it's going to be, Peyton, or they're going to move on to interviews to re-interview Brian Flores, Ejiro Evero, and Aaron Glenn. And now Jonathan Gannon kind of in the mix. Vance Joseph seems to be odd man out, and now staff members are starting to leave. So
that's what I was going to say. He had a guy that left too, who's actually, probably one of their better coaches.
Yeah, Charlie Bullen, outside linebackers coach. He's headed to University of Illinois to coach outside linebackers and be a pass rush coordinator there. So the writing is on the wall that the Vance Joseph time is over. Maybe we will know something more by Tuesday. I don't know. It feels like.
Let me ask you something, because somebody, I can't remember who it was, tweeted out earlier today about Aaron Glenn.
Jonathan Jones, CBS Sports.
Okay, yeah. So Jonathan Jones kind of, I'm trying to find the tweet so I can get it correctly. There it is. There he is. And, you look at it, he's a guy that's fairly dialed in. I feel like. I mean, he's not as big as obviously guys like Adam Schefter and these guys, but he's well liked, well respected, and he said this: a name that makes a lot of sense for the Cardinals' next head coach is Aaron Glenn, a former player who would bring leadership and accountability there ASAP, familiar with reshaping a team from his 2 years with the Lions, a Texas guy who has known Kyler Murray and his family for a while. Now, one of the things that we do know, and I'm not ever accusing a reporter of this, so I just want that to be clear, but one of the things we do know is that agents and or the players themselves or coaches tend to use things like that to leak to
That's one
the
way that
press
media
and-
reports get out.
right. And so what do you think about that? Do you think it's a serious consideration thing, or do you think
That would be, for me, of the candidates that are out there, the most out there hire of the group? Doesn't it feel like that? At least Evero had a great defense this year with Denver. It was the only thing that kept them together. Glenn's defense in Detroit has been, though they were okay over the last 6 games. But that's a name when people, when it was reported that he was interviewed, like, what? Wait, what?
yeah.
Because, that it would be, I'm trying to think, kind of surprise hirings or that you don't know. But I don't remember what the reaction was for Anthony Lynn. And maybe, honestly, kind of like Vance Joseph in Denver.
I'm going back just because I honestly don't remember when Steve Wilkes was there. So they were 11th in defense that year. They went 11-5. I know that was his first year because it was McDermott beforehand. 11-5. They had a terrible pass defense, but they had like the best rushing defense in the NFL. Okay. And then looking at Glenn, they're 25th in points, 28th in points allowed, excuse me, which is, for those scoring at home, better than the Cardinals, but still not good. Middle of the pack in turnovers forced. Worse than the Cardinals in passing defense and rushing defense. So, I mean, man, but yeah, geez, man, yeah, that would be an interesting hire, just from a obviously overall bulk stats usage. That would be an interesting one. I do like the idea of him being obviously a former player, so the accountability thing in the room and things like that. And he's been part of a team, been part of a crew that has completely reshaped that Detroit Lions culture. And then you look at what he did in New Orleans with the defensive backs there, his 4 seasons as the DB coach. His first seasons, they were last in the NFL in yardage. By the time he left in 20, they were 5th in yardage. So, I mean, you look at it, he was, he really, and obviously other guys helped, especially, Dennis Allen's defense, but so given time and players and additions, he took them from the 32nd passing defense to the 5th in passing defense, and they were 4th in rushing defense. I don't know what they were beforehand, but he had, he was a DB coach, so we'll give him the the good part of passing. But yeah, I mean, I just, like you said, it would be a really odd.
Especially when they're considering Sean Payton. It's bad enough that it feels like they're swinging for the fences with Sean Payton or they're going with Brian Flores. And that's a vast difference. But if they go from Sean Payton to Aaron Glenn, who has no track record of head coaching, that's even more underwhelming. And not that it has to be overwhelming. A Sean Payton deal feels very on brand for Michael Bidwell, as long as he's willing to take home run swings like that. Brian Flores, to me, looks like the guy that fits the best organizationally, but that doesn't mean he's the right choice, and it doesn't move the needle at all for fans who are looking for some excitement.
So let me ask you this, and I'm going back through everything. You know who this would really be like? And so this is, again, wondering out loud of why this could be something we see, is like when the Titans hired Mike Vrabel to be their head coach. So Vrabel was a linebackers coach for the Texans for 3 seasons. In his 1 season as defensive coordinator for the Houston Texans, they were 32nd. They were the worst team in points allowed. 24th in passing yards. Turnovers, they were 27th. I mean, so we're just kind of, again, running through bulk stats, not doing any deep dives. And they went 4-12, and that was, I believe, Bill O'Brien's 2nd season? No, 3rd season. Okay. And so, and then they, and he got hired as the Titans head coach off of that. Austin Fort wasn't there at the time, but he was in Tennessee long enough with Vrabel that he saw the culture, right? So I wonder if that is more important to him than what the defense was. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it completely makes sense. It does. It does, absolutely.
So I mean, that's how I would look at it and compare it. Like, Vrabel was a terrible defensive coordinator in his 1 season. I mean, there's no other way around it. I mean, you're literally talking about a guy that finished everywhere in like his defense finished 32nd in points, 20th in yards, 22nd in rushing touchdowns, 29th in passing touchdowns. Like, this is, 30th in net yards average. And then he went to the Titans and, 3rd in points, 12th, 24th. And then last year they were 6th in points. Like, again, sometimes it's about the man and the culture as opposed to the statistics. Now, again, like you said, that's how you and I are going to spin it, obviously, if he ends up being the guy. But it definitely, to your point, would definitely be a very underwhelming hire.
Absolutely. Well, we'll leave this edition at that. We'll wrap things up, and we will bring back our regular Tuesday show where we'll have more to talk about. We might have more coaching stuff to talk about. We definitely have some stuff to talk about with Kyler Murray. So that's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. This is the Rise Up See Red podcast. We'll be back again in a few days. Thanks for listening as always.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, See Red, and of course, Rise Up, See Red.
Roll!